First off, I just want to say this week's response papers did a really good job. I don't know if these papers were particularly interesting, more so than previous weeks, but lots of threes, which, way to go. Keep up the good work for these last couple weeks. Let's see, secondly, next week, if you look at the syllabus, it says a progress report in the section on your term papers. Just to give you guys a little heads up about what that's going to be, we're going to take just a few minutes in class, just go around the room, say like literally one sentence about what your paper is about, and then any sort of issues or things that you might want to talk out. Right? So if there's, if you're struggling finding a really good paper to do X, right, and maybe someone else has found that paper that you need, right? Bring those questions, so we can sort of help each other finish these papers, or at least if you're, alternatively, if you're still in the thought process and haven't even really begun to dig into the research and stuff, right? If you're looking for that place to start, try to help each other figure that out too. Okay. Lastly, you may have noticed the camera in the room, and two people who aren't normally here. I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, not last week, but I'm having an individual teaching consultation, so they're videotaping me, not you guys, but go ahead and make me look good anyway. Okay, so, and last thing, for those of you who filled out that little survey that I sent out, the Google Doc, thank you for the feedback on how the course is going. If you haven't yet, it's not too late to fill it out. And I'll try to incorporate your feedback into these last few weeks. That's really just for me and for us as a section to make it the best class that we can. So that's, thank you for those of you who filled that out. Okay, so let's get into this week. And I want to start out a little differently, rather than pairing up and talking for a while about the papers. I think we can just kind of launch into the full group discussion. Since you guys raised a lot of really good issues in your discussion papers, so I just kind of wanted to start out with have you guys sort of set, like we did. All right, so like we did a few weeks ago, have you guys sort of raised the big questions that you want to talk about with these papers? And I will write them up here on the board so that we have sort of a map for this discussion. So just off the top of your head, any big issues that you had with the paper that you want to cover in discussion and bring up with everybody?
Writing and effortful commitment.
Okay. So two different things.
I guess they kind of fall in the same thing, but yeah.
Okay. Right, or even kind of writing as effortful.
Yeah.
Right, if you want to talk about it together. Yeah, so this idea of when you're sort of asked to make a commitment by writing something down, it really seems to stick. The same thing with this idea of effortful commitment from the hazing example, the paper and the class. And then when you go through that sort of ritualistic humiliation. Yeah. That's a good place to start. Yes, Steve.
Different size rewards or threats in terms of long and short-term compliance. So
what do you mean by rewards and threats?
So, for example, telling someone that they'll get a big reward for doing something now, how that affects their compliance in the short term or the long term, the same thing. It's true with threats. Like the kids playing with the toys.
Oh, it's reward and punishment. Really.
Yeah.
We're going back to like, Pavlovian conditioning. Well, it's technically operant conditioning, but this is not a learning class. Right? All right, cool. Anyone else? Yeah.
Something that I brought up in my paper was when talking about commitment to consistency in others. So like not just within yourself, but like when they're talking about the pro-Castro, anti-Castro, like fundamental attributionary stuff, like how we kind of map that onto other people instead of just ourselves.
Sure. So I mean, so like, sort of the social ramifications for this, right? Yeah, a lot of you guys talk about that in your papers. This sort of thinking of commitment and you know, commitment bias, so to speak, and how it's sort of a social construct. I think that's really good.
Mental slacking.
Mental slacking.
Yeah.
Elaborate on that.
Like he always talks about like the jujitsu or whatever.
Oh, sure.
We just kind of use our own brain power to do whatever's easiest for us.
Yeah, right. I mean, it kind of goes all the way back to the idea of heuristics.
Yeah.
Right? This idea that we're always trying to find a way to think at the least amount possible. Right? Yeah. Oh, 3 points.
I didn't get it first.
Okay. That doesn't really matter. Whoever wants to go.
Okay. I was just gonna say maybe like as an offshoot of the social nature of commitment, the like public consistency versus private consistency, like how others perceive you as consistent versus like how your own feelings of consistency.
Sure. Yeah, definitely. So. Right, there's a sort of social demand for you to be consistent versus your own internal cognitive dissonance to a certain extent, right? That you want to be, you want to act consistent with your own beliefs.
I was just kind of interested in the idea that, you know, someone plants that small seed and then it grows its own legs. And if it's not a bad thing and you like come to believe in it, like does it still count as like a true belief, or is it like I was kind of puzzled at how how to think about that.
Yeah, no, so
Like the table picture in the consistency chapter, I thought that was
yeah,
it starts
sort of an
like
interesting
sit down
diagram.
and also
So.
children raising. Yeah.
Yeah, so the way commitment sort of grows its own legs. All right, Grace, last one. Then we should start talking about something.
Subliminally manipulating yourself, and by that I'm referring to creeping determinism and how you use like thought and error, I guess, to forecast the future.
Okay. Yeah. We go sort of self-subliminal.
Yeah.
All right, cool. So we should have nonstop discussion with all these great ideas to go around with. So, all right, so let's start out with talking about this sort of effortful commitment just as a whole, and Jerome's idea of writing as effortful commitment, right? So, I don't know if you want to start off.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just think it's very interesting that just like the act of writing would cause such like a jump in terms of commitment. I think that the Chinese prison, I guess, anecdote is very powerful. I'd like to discuss that, I guess, hear what you guys think about it.
Yeah, sure. So, okay, so we have the Chinese prisoners, American prisoners of war in China during the Korean War. Right? So, anyone want to review for us what their sort of psychological format was.
You have to first agree to like write something that kind of corroborates like what the Chinese want to think. So like you have to say that like America is the perfect place, and like say like I think like Chinese like communism works well for China or something like that. So you start very small, and then like once you write it down, like they can like they have like this evidence showing that like you don't like what you believe in. I mean like they have like easy time like manipulating like into believing that like you believe in like what you've written, even though like it was kind of like written like kind of like grudgingly and like against your beliefs, and then like they kind of build on that and like get increasingly. Sorry, never mind. I'm confused.
Yeah. Oh, you're right. Yeah.
Just to build on that a little bit with like the public versus private, how like once you've written it, you know, they would show that around to other people or, you know, read the announcement, and how, you know, when they publicize it, it makes you feel uncomfortable or tension, and, you know, maybe you internalize it more and you want to be consistent. Or even if other people project that onto you after hearing it.
Yeah, so it's the idea of cognitive dissonance, and we try to resolve that, and we wind up, you know, in this case, resolving it by becoming even more sympathetic for the Chinese, your Chinese captors, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. The way they were handling this.
So I think there's this study where like people were asked to write down like a number or something that they thought on like this magic pad, and like some people were asked to either just think about it and not write it down. Other people were asked to just write it on a pad, and the last people were asked to write it on a pad and then erase it. And they measured like who would be more truthful with their answers or something like that. So I guess
So what was the?
if you write it down, obviously, and you don't erase it, those are the people that are the most truthful because they avoid cognitive dissonance or whatever. And second most, of course, are the people that erase it, and then third are the verbal. But so I was wondering, like, I think that even if they wrote it down, there's some kind of mental process going on that even if they like burn the paper afterwards, there would still be some sort of leftover kind of thing that would be in their brain, kind of not even, I don't know if you could call it like a crime, but like some kind of deceit that's what you look at.
Yeah, so that's, yeah.
I think like another like really important factor in this scenario is that they were like not forced to do any of this. Like it was important that it was written down, but it's also really important that they were just like suggested or asked to do this, and they weren't given major threats or anything like that. And so then once they, you know, had these like written down in front of them, and then, you know, they did go on to, they said like read them over the radio or whatever. But, you know, they had this in their head that like nobody forced me to do this. I, you know, wrote this down. I was, you know, just told like, you know, maybe write down some reasons why you think the U.S. isn't perfect. Nobody, you know, set a list out in front of them and said, you copy this or I'm going to kill you or anything, you know, extreme like that. So it was, you know, that kind of idea that they were almost doing it out of their own free will that was really produced the dissonance, I think, even more so than just writing it on paper. Like even if they had thought it, it would still show the same because they weren't forced.
Yeah, right. So and that sort of ties really nicely together with the idea of the hazing, right? Mm-hmm. How talks in there about how the idea of wouldn't it be great if they turned hazing into you know, public service, right? Where you could actually do something productive while humiliating your pledges, but that would never work, right? Anyone remember why? Yeah.
Because they could explain away like what they've done by saying, oh, I was doing it, you know, for public service. And, you know, that would kind of take away, you know, it would kind of like eliminate the bad things that they did. They could, you know, put it on this positive reason instead of just all negative.
And so then it wouldn't tie them to the fraternity. They would be like, oh, I was doing all these terrible things because I want to help the community, not because I want to be a part of this fraternity, and so they wouldn't have the really strong ties that they would have been there. Like, oh, there's no other reason for me to do this except that I must really want to be a part of this fraternity.
Yeah, exactly. And the sort of the way that you phrase it in the chapter is that you have to own it, right? You have to sort of, you know, take all of the awful experience and be like, like you guys were saying, there's no other reason to do this other than I just must really love all of my fraternity brothers, or I must really sort of believe these things that I'm writing about, what's not perfect in America. Right? So that's one really, really good a tie-in there. Because another thing I was thinking of with the writing when you brought it up in your paper, right, is when you write something down, there's a whole lot more sensory experience that goes into that, right? You have the motor, tactile, visual, the thought process that goes into it, right? And basically, it's sort of a, for anyone familiar with the sort of memory research, right? It's a more elaborate process. You're elaborating on it when you're writing it down more than if you just say it out loud, or than if you just think it to yourself, right? Because you're enacting all of these different representations, and that's going to make it sort of sit even more strongly in your memory. And then that's going to most likely really create even more cognitive dissonance that you have to then resolve by sort of taking ownership of it. So I think that goes into your question of why is writing so effective. I think that sort of plays into it. So okay, moving right along. So this idea of reward and punishment. Steven, do you want to elaborate on again, just a little bit, get the ball rolling on this one?
Yeah, so I was just interested by the discussion that was had in the paper and in class about if there's, too big of a punishment or too big of a reward, it only really works towards short-term compliance for a particular goal. And I was wondering, in what situations that remains to be true, and in what situations, it doesn't. Because I'd imagine that as long as there's still the possibility of major punishment or major reward, compliance will still be there. But I feel like the circumstances that we were, told about was when that threat went away, which is sort of a different situation.
Yeah. And this sort of feeds really nicely off the previous discussion that we were just having. Right? So this idea of, in the case of the effortful commitment, right, that you're taking on a kind of a beating, but it's not really punishment. And then the Chinese prisoners, right, there really is there's no real threat there.
So they have small rewards though.
Like, right.
Contest for like cigarettes and fruit, I think. Yeah, and that was extremely effective. I'm interested to why that worked, as opposed to like.
There was one point that they purposely gave them very small rewards,
Yeah.
and it was more effective in some ways than big rewards, right?
Yeah.
And it goes back to what we were just talking about in that, if they wrote some really great essay and they're like, oh, I did it, for however many packs of cigarettes or for free time. I think it's the same idea of, you can't, say, oh, I feel this strongly because I just want 3 cigarettes. Like, you have to own it. Like, 3 cigarettes is not,
It's not enough to sell out your country.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Isn't that kind of sort of in contradiction with the effortful commitment though? Like the fact that you're doing something for so little, but it's not, like, I wouldn't say that it's arduous to write anything down, but whereas like, I don't know, the hazing is pretty arduous, and the reward, I guess, you make in your mind to be very good.
Yeah, so it's kind of, well, yeah, what do you guys think about that? Does it seem incongruous to you, or how can we make it not? How do those two things sort of go hand in hand? Because I see them as sort of being the same thing. Okay, so on the one hand, you have threat of severe punishment or really great reward versus small punishment or small reward, right? And let's just, So, and the small punishment and rewards are more effective at long-term change versus hazing, which is, what I'm saying, is just this arduous, awful experience that then results in sort of attitude change about, or not even change, but really strong commitment to the group. Right? So why? Let's start out there. Why do you guys think that in one case this really difficult ordeal is what leads to commitment, and in another, this really small degree of reward or punishment leads to Rachel?
I feel like hazing is different from like strong punishment, just because everyone's supposed to have gone through it. Also, like you will become your captor in a sense once you get through it, which is not really the case for a lot of other punishment scenarios.
Yeah, and I think more importantly, like hazing itself isn't like a zero-sum thing. You're not like one night like you get hazed and then it's over. It's like a bunch of small like risks and rewards that you're getting along the way, which like builds up into a much larger thing. So it's not like really like I see them very similar in that sense, I guess.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say that too, like it's over a long period of time usually, and hazing, the point of it, I mean, the argument for it is that it's a bonding experience for people, so that is automatically going to, foster a sense of commitment. Usually it's not meant, well, hopefully it's not meant to be an extreme punishment type of thing, because the idea of when you get out on the other side of it, everybody, or fraternity or whatever it is, a sports team, like everybody has gone through it. So I think that that's where the commitment is, birthed from, is the sense, like that bonding experience over time.
Yeah.
Actually, I think like they could be kind of like related in the like it's got to like your ego and like how you value yourself. So like for like hazing, it's going to be like you've gone through this like humiliation and you get like nothing out of it. Like you leave the group without finishing the ritual, you're going to feel bad about yourself because you just suffered all this thing for like no reward. So like you feel compelled to like finish it and like become the part of the group to kind of like reap your initial investment. And like for like small reward kind of thing, it can be like the same thing. It's like, let's say like you're one of the like prisoner of wars in like China. Like you sell your country for 3 cigarettes, you're going to be like, well, why do you do this? But like if I try to like rationalize my action as like I did it for the cigarettes, you're going to feel like a piece of crap. So like you're not going to do that. So like you're going to like rationalize yourself and to like make it so that like I did it because I believe in it. So like you don't have to think about the consequences of like your actions.
Yeah, that's like exactly what I was trying to convey before. It's like you get your foot in the door with like little things, so there'll be like little risks and little rewards, and before you know it, you've already invested a major amount of time, so you can put yourself into these much more arduous long-term deals.
Yeah, just one thing I want to talk about is sort of this classic study in sort of this rationalization of behavior and the benefits of small rewards in particular. It's sort of a classic study where subjects come in and they sit down and the task that they're asked to do, in the model of all psychology experience, is pretty mind-numbingly boring. But this is even more boring than usual. They sit there for an hour and they turn pegs. It's like 100 pegs. And they just turn them like a quarter turn, over and over and over and over and over again, right? And then they're done, and they get paid. And then when they're leaving, the experimenter asks them to go out into the waiting room where the supposed next subject is waiting, who's actually a confederate of the experimenter, right? And tell this next person who's going to do the experiment that it's a really interesting experiment, right? Just tell them how much you loved it and you just had so much fun and that they'll have a great time too. right? And then leave, right? And so it's not anything about the peg turning experiment. It's all about this sort of interaction with the person. And the trick was that some people received, I forget exactly what it amounted to.
It's like $1.
Yeah, it was like $1 and $20. And so just like the small and large reward, well, this is a small and large reward, but in the prison study, right, the people who got $1, when asked a week later, they really thought that, you know, oh, that peg turning, that was pretty fun. Right? Even though, you know, if you asked them immediately, they thought it was soul-crushingly awful. Right? Versus the $20 people, they still thought it was a terrible experience, but hey, they got $20. Right? So it's sort of this whole idea of rationalizing. You know, if you got that big reward, you can thank that big reward for why you suffered that awful experience. Versus if you only got a small reward, you know, and you actually told someone that it was really entertaining, then at least a small part of you must have thought that it was really entertaining. So, and this sort of feeds nicely into this sort of social aspect of this, and the way that we sort of present ourselves, not only to ourselves, but to other people, thinking about commitment and consistency. Right? The chapter talks a lot about how society sees it as a really valuable trait to be a consistent person. Yeah. And so, yeah, so Susanna, your paper talked a lot about the sort of social nature of this commitment and what sort of how the community is conceived of. At least I thought when I was reading your paper, you conceive of it as sort of like a social contract where that you have with other people.
Yeah, so one of the papers was talking a lot about consistency and how people the thing with the sign, when they did something small and then a week later they would be more willing to have that huge drive carefully sign on their lawn. And then the author cited two other people who concluded that people change their whole image of themselves, and that's why they're doing these things, because they personally think they're oh, we're good people, we support these causes and stuff like that. Whereas for me, I thought maybe it was not as drastic as that, and it's just more in terms of reciprocity and people expecting other people to be consistent, and so in terms of a mutual helping or something like that. So how much of consistency is really a socially driven, and how much of it is just an internal thing.
Yeah, that was a question that a lot of people had in their response papers, right? To what degree is this drive to be consistent something that's really important to each and every one of us, and to what extent is it it's important to look good to other people, to look consistent to other people. You know,
and I think something that kind of speak to it as being internal is how when they with the Drive Carefully experiment, they did a follow-up where the first thing that they agreed to was not related. So it wasn't it was the same group, it wasn't it was the same person, it was just oh, I'll sign this petition to keep California beautiful or whatever it was. And so that's totally separate. And then they have this entirely new individual coming up being a couple weeks later hey, do you want to put this big sign in your lawn? So it wasn't oh, well, I already told the Drive Carefully campaign that I would help them out, I don't want to turn my back on them now. And it could be just as easy if you want to look socially responsible, be oh, well, I already signed this Keep California Beautiful thing, I've done my social part, these people don't know, I don't want to do the Drive Carefully, but they still put it up. So I think that kind of speaks to the idea that they were trying to internalize well, I did this good thing, so I must be a really good person, so I need to continue to do these good things, as opposed to just trying to look good socially.
Yeah, just sort of check off your I've been good today box. Right? That it's actually sort of doing some, your sort of resolution is really changing.
Yes. I guess like in all the examples we've talked about, it's kind of been basically like how I've broken it down is like getting your foot in the door, doing all these small things leads to some kind of attitudinal change, and so there's a real case for commitment to be like a private thing, and cognitive dissonance to be like private and not really a social construct. Or I guess it's private because of social construct.
Yeah, it's such a strong social contract that you internalize it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that, right. That it's effective at attitude change, in particular when it's a slow escalation. Yeah. Yeah, if you guys are familiar at all with the literature on attitude change, the best way to get someone to change is through small incremental things that, oh, of course I agree with this, I agree with that, and I agree with that, right? Same as the Chinese prisoners, right? If you start out by saying America isn't perfect, and then it snowballs into, you know, I love China, then that's, right, that's the progression.
So then something along the lines of that I also wrote about is, so these attitude changes do exist, but how long do they exist, like, after these, like, small incremental things? Like, what if those incremental things stop? Like, in a lot of these cases, this was just, like, a lab experiment. So, really, like, further down the line, how long do these things actually last in your mind? Or how long do you think, oh, I should actually keep doing these things? Or just dropping it just because you forget about it or something?
Yeah, that's a good question. What do you guys think? I mean, like, this is just spitballing here, but do you think that this is sort of long-term, continual change, or is it sort of a momentary thing that you'll just sort of revert back after a short period of time, or even as soon as you leave the lab?
Well, I mean, I think that, like, it's probably pretty obvious, but I think that it stays the same until it changes. So, being that we're pretty fickle, like, I think if we had this kind of attitudinal change, like being, I don't know, very proactive in like the environment or something like that, because of like a survey we signed, which is hard to believe, but like all the research points to that actually being the cause. Until like something else comes along that, or until we have like some other interest that kind of conflicts with that, I think that's how long we keep that attitude.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see the same thing. Like, I know there's a study here, and I don't know if we read about it in this class either, but like when you do a study and they assign you to a group, like so they have like the lions and tigers study, you automatically like associate with that group, and you're like, this is my group for the rest of the time. And then when you leave, you know, does that stay? Typically not. You're not going to be like, oh, I hate tigers from now on. But that's just like one instance where when you're in that lab setting, you're like pretty much completely committed to that, and then when it's over, it's done.
Yeah. So I think that's sort of getting at a different sort of principle than this idea of attitude change or even, you know, dissonance resolution, right? It's when you're in that situation and you're in that group and that group is together, right? Then that's a really powerful bond, right? But then, you know, when the experiment's over, you're probably never going to see some of these people again.
Right, and I mean, we do the same thing in a lot of our classes when we have like debates, and you know, your professor splits the class in half, and you may be forced to take a view that you don't necessarily agree with, but you have to get, you know, to win or do whatever. It's a similar thing. Like, it's not going to change. If you're not for abortion, but you have to be for this one class period, it's not going to change your, you know, entire outlook for the rest of your life.
Yeah. That's sort of an interesting segue into one example from the paper is that what Martha, you focused your paper on was the Castro essay study, right? So the setup for this, right, is you read an essay that is either pro Fidel Castro or anti Fidel Castro, and you're told that the author of this essay is either pro or anti Castro. Right? So either they're pro Castro and they wrote this pro Castro essay, they're anti Castro and they wrote this anti Castro essay, or it's reversed, right? And they're anti-Castro, but they were forced to write a pro-Castro essay. Yeah. Right. You want to remember what they meant and why it's interesting. Yeah.
They showed that people who read, like for example, a pro-Castro essay, even if they were told, you know, this person was required to write this essay, they still rated them as being more pro-Castro than somebody who wrote an anti-Castro essay. Which was really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, so no matter what, so right, like in the debate that Aaron was just prefacing, even though you were assigned to be, you know, anti-abortion, everyone who observes you is going to think, well, I know they were forced to take that anti-abortion stance, but maybe they really believe it. And sort of gets into a really sort of critical piece of social psychology. It's called the fundamental attribution error, or also called correspondence bias. But that title's never stuck with me. But take it away, it means the same thing. But it's this idea that when you're sort of evaluating the actions of other people, you discount or don't really pay attention to any external factors or the mitigating circumstances that sort of led them to behave that way. And you attribute their behavior to their own personality and their own personality traits, their own disposition. Which is kind of interesting because on the flip side, we do the exact opposite thing for justifying our own behavior, right? If, you know, particularly if you look back in the past at some foolish thing you did when you were a teenager, you'll, you know, sort of, you know, wave that away by saying, oh, that wasn't me, that was, you know, or that was me, but I was just a foolish kid, or I was, you know, there was some peer pressure or whatever, right? You put all the blame on something else. It wasn't me, right? And it actually sort of tailors in with this whole consistency idea. And this idea, you know, when you look back in your past and you evaluate all the things that you've done, you sort of perceive yourself as being, you know, stalwart and true, right? Your personality has never wavered, even if you've done something completely that doesn't really jive with your own personality narrative. You will try to explain that away as not being part of, you know, as being a sort of spurious one-time thing that was driven by other factors. Okay? The drive to appear and think of yourself as consistent, but it's really pervasive in cases like that.
I
Yeah.
was actually thinking about this. I have a question about that. Would the people, I don't remember talking about this in the paper, but was it like real people? Was it like a person who was anti-Castro, like, was actually forced to write? Because I was wondering, because they're still writing it down, so even though the person reading them is doing a fundamental attribution, like, could it still change their perceptions when they're writing?
So it wasn't actually written, right? So they just had two essays that were
Okay, that's what I was
one that was
wondering.
pro and one that was anti, and yeah, they weren't written by particular people, but yeah, that would be like sort of follow-up study is actually have someone, you know, force them to write a pro Castro essay and then have them rate their opinion of Castro. What do you guys think their opinions of Castro would be based on all this other stuff that we've been reading about?
I think it would depend on the size of the reward or punishment they were getting for writing their essay. If they were like, you know, oh, would you just help us out, write this essay for the study, you know, it'd be nice. Then there would be maybe like not have as much to justify, whereas if they were like, we will pay you $20 if you write this Procaster essay for us. Like,
I think there's also evidence, like the other way around, that like if you challenge somebody's beliefs like gently, then they become even more convicted of them. So I think that that essay might actually serve as like a challenge to somebody's beliefs. I don't know. I was thinking about that too, all during the Chinese, because they're like for indoctrination, the best way to make somebody like believe in something even more is to like gently challenge their beliefs.
But sometimes people are just like extremely defensive and don't even really listen to what they say.
Yeah.
Like I just think of a lot of like debates on news, like on CNN or something, where people just are so convicted. They don't want to look like an idiot on TV, so they're really convicted in what they say. And maybe they do change their ideas, but it's off screen.
Right. Well, you think the same would hold in that like experiment, the Castro thing? Like,
I do. I think that was a really convincing experiment. But I guess I'm just like about the whole, I don't know, violent debates. I think people are just, especially like political, like a what do you call them, presidential debates that are televised. It's like the stakes are so high that it's almost much more about presenting a certain image than it is about like maintaining your core beliefs or even thinking about what your beliefs are. Like it's all scripted and it's almost a completely different phenomenon.
Yeah.
Okay. Trying to figure out how to get this all in. So I want to get to this idea of mental slacking, having the heuristics that we've been talking about pretty much all quarter, right? With this idea of consistency and commitment, right? So, what do you guys think? Are we just pre-programmed to think as little as possible? Is that our goal? Is to get through the day without really challenging ourselves? I mean, not here at the University of Chicago. And like, yeah,
I think a lot of people think that mental slacking and like doing things as quickly as possible equates to efficiency. So that can be like a misinterpretation in that sense. I think students at UC want to learn and want to know more and want to, keep expanding their mind, but I do think that mental slacking has to correlate a lot with efficiency or the idea of efficiency. Isn't that like an individual differences thing? Like this might be a little bit beyond the scope of the class, but like need for cognition. Like some people have a high need for cognition and some people have a low need for cognition. Has not been like kind of established as like a paradigm as like a dual like individual differences. Like some people are high and some people are low.
Yeah.
So that's where you would like find that difference in people who are like have a low need for cognition. That would be more like the mental slackers and people who are constantly looking for shortcuts and the easiest way to do things. Whereas like people with a high need for cognition would be more likely to try and figure things out methodically and be more like less looking for shortcuts. But I think that there's also like if you have a high need for cognition, you're not always going to use that. If you're under a time crunch, you can also find the ability to find the shortcuts if you need to. But then vice versa, the low need for cognition people could, if they needed to, if they had a lot of time and were required to take a little bit extra time to think through things, then they could also do that. But I think in general, there's that kind of duality there.
Like I agree with that. There's also evidence that like having high working memory means that you're more likely to engage in mental slacking. Just because that when you're not really forced to think very hard about something, your mind kind of wanders, and all your mental energy is devoted to that wandering. So when you're actually called upon to think about something that's at hand, you use like a shortcut or a heuristic to make that decision. So there's kind of like, this division of mental energy.
Yeah. That's interesting because when you started talking about working memory, I thought you were going in a completely different direction than where you did, because I was thinking about research that's been done right here, actually, that shows that when doing math problems, in particular, under stress, so you stress people out by putting a camera in the room and telling them that your performance on this math test, you're going to get a reward if you exceed this certain level of performance, and it's contingent on you and this other person exceeding this certain level, and they already did it, so if you don't, then they're not going to get the reward either, and oh, by the way, can we use this videotape to teach other people, and really just completely overload them with stress. People with high working memory, who are normally much better at math in general, math problems, their performance suffers dramatically, versus the people with low working memory, their performance, it's lower, but it doesn't change when they're stressed out. And the thinking behind this is that the people with low working memory are already using the heuristics, right? So if you're doing math, these difficult math problems, you're going to try to find the shortcuts to get to the answer as quickly as possible if you don't have the ability to hold all of these complicated processes in mind. I mean, it's sort of the same. Yeah, but it's sort of the same thing, right? If you have a lot of working memory in general, you can allocate it to a bunch of different things, and so then when you have to just do something, use that quick heuristic. Versus in the case of low working memory, you want to be devoting that to whatever you want to stay on task as much as possible.
Is there a correlation between need for cognition and working memory?
I'm sure there is, but I don't.
It's not like.
I don't know. Like I haven't seen the literature on it, so I don't want to say one way or the other. But I'm sure someone can find it. Okay, so we should get to our key contributors real quick, and then we have time at the end to get back to our last two little discussion points there. So who wants to go first? Peter and Anna.
I don't mind. Actually, I have a comment to say about what we just talked about that I think weaves into my paper, so maybe I'll just go first. So just one thing about that is just this simplification and using like heuristics and developing simplification models. That's something that my paper actually did talk a lot about. But I do think that that's a lot of what scientific progression is all about. Like, we can only understand we can only make advancement if we understand what already we aren't touched it. No, I know it's a really vague way of explaining it. I'll get back to it when it comes up in my paper, but I just think that's a really interesting dilemma. Are we lazy, or are we just trying to simplify things so we can actually advance? So my paper was called, it was actually very similar to the Fishoff paper, much more, so really switching gears a lot. Sorry, let me just pull it up. Yeah, here we are. So, so the paper is called Hindsight Biased Judgments of Past Events After the Outcomes Are Known. It was written by Scott Hawkins and Reed Hasty. Hawkins is actually a Booth professor. So the idea is really, it really picks off where Fishoff left off. It's kind of a summary paper of a lot of the research that's out there. So there wasn't an actual experiment, but I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible since it does cover so much as a summary paper. It looks at past events. They seem comprehensive and predictable, whereas future events are nebulous and unknown, and really looks at this known all along concept. They looked at in the lab studies across all these papers and noticed how individuals receive information about a target event. Then they're split into two groups, so some are informed of the outcome and some aren't. And then after that, they're asked to estimate the likelihood of an event occurring before they receive that information. And of course, always they show some sort of hindsight bias. And one of the questions that's posed really early in the paper is, what's the difference between hindsight and learning from experience? And this concept of creeping determinism that we talked a little bit about briefly, but it's something that's really central to the Fishoff paper and a lot of subsequent hindsight experiments and analysis. Again, this proving determinism is the outcome that is immediately integrated into knowledge of events preceding it. And then they look at, through these papers, examples of historical events, psychiatric cases, scientific experiments, everyday events, like they listed as an everyday event, like buying a house, which I don't really know if that's an everyday event, football games, election outcomes, medical and legal cases, which I think are the most fascinating of these examples that they looked at, and finally, like trivia questions, which they call almanac data. So that term will probably come up a lot. And they separate between these two sort of divisions. So the knew it all along, which are the factual almanac data, which is like where is Aladdin from, as an example, like Aladdin, the Disney character, the mythical being or person, I guess. And then they estimate the probability of them being correct. And then the other situation is probability of judgment. So estimate the probability of event outcomes. And since we have to know the result, these are all historical outcomes, so they can actually have control. So the hindsight effect is usually larger in almanac questions than the actual judgment. So this is, I think, kind of interesting because it does show that people, well, the reason for this that the author gave was that it's probably due to motivational stuff. So people wanting to look smart in front of the interrogator, which is, it's pretty interesting. I don't know if I entirely believe that, but I think it's on the right track. So desire to appear intelligent, towards the experimenter probably plays a larger role in these situations than it would in like predicting the outcome of an experiment. Or of a historical event or something like that. And so there are a couple of associated psychological phenomena here. There's the recall of personal attitudes after persuasive communication. So that's like if someone, I think we were talking a little bit about this, about like the debates, if someone really convinces you of one sort of, setting, do you go back to your earlier idea and change it? The misapplication of jury instructions, which, to be completely honest, didn't really make a lot of sense the way that was written in the article, but I think that refers to like juries being sort of persuaded by evidence in a trial, and maybe not really remembering or understanding earlier evidence that was presented to them. Bias in eyewitness testimony, which is where if you're a witness for a certain, like the defense or the in a case, then you might actually be influenced to sort of give evidence that supports that as opposed to the other side. And then seeing patterns in stock market prices, which, there are probably no patterns. So to invent these patterns that don't exist is an example of hindsight bias. Distorted evaluations of decision quality. So this is like, we kind of did this in class where we rated our, our belief in how correct we were. And this is like always distorted. I'm not really sure how that is quite hindsight bias, but the main point of the paper was to review all these different studies and look at the empirical research and examine really deeply on this creeping determinism. They looked at these 4 strategies, which are the selection of evidence, the evaluation of evidence, integration of evidence, and